So I'm going to talk to you today about something that's been neglected for a very long time as hand function in people with multiple sclerosis. And I'm going to talk about a clinical trial that we've just completed. Well, we've just presented the results. The trial finished about 6 months ago. And the results are very positive, and I want to share that with you. So the question is, how important is hand function to somebody with multiple sclerosis? So when you actually got early disease, you don't think about your hands, you think mostly around your leg function, being able to walk. However, when somebody ends up in a wheelchair, for example, their hands become their legs in the sense that's what keeps you independent. So we had this insight that, why do we ignore hand function? And the reason I say that, though, is that once you become a wheelchair user in the UK and the NHS, you are ineligible for any therapies to slow down your disease. And similarly, when you're on a treatment, and I assume some of you may still be on disease-modifying therapies, the NHS mandates that you stop your treatment when you become a wheelchair user on the assumption that it doesn't work. And the reason why that happens is when we've done trials in the past, only people that are mobile have been included in trials. They've never done trials of people in wheelchairs. And so that's kind of where there's what we call an evidence gap. So I'm going to discuss things around that today. So this is actually two little graphs. This is actually old data, but it would not have changed. So this actually was from 2015, the data from Europe. It was a pan-European study, and Britain was part of this study. And this is your disability score, EDSS, and you know that when you become a wheelchair user, your score is 7. And when you start losing hand function, it's 8. So from 7 to 8, or 7.5, 8, 8.5, that's when hand function starts to deteriorate and you're already in a wheelchair. You can see this is actually the utility, which is a quality of life score. You can see the quality of life suddenly plummets when people lose their ability to walk, but it goes down even worse when you lose your hand function. And you can understand that because as soon as you lose your hand function, then you're relying on carers and people to look after you. You can't look after yourself. So that's why it just plummets, okay? And the cost, this is in our price parity. Back in 2015, this is euros. And I assume now this will be double that because it's 10 years ago with inflation. You can see the costs go up when you become a wheelchair user, but they go up massively when you start losing hand function. And the reason for that is because you need extra care. And that's around about 60,000. So it's probably about 100,000. Let's talk about 100,000 plus pounds per year. It will cost the government to look after somebody who loses hand function with multiple sclerosis. So it's a big, big burden on people. Quality of life and cost. So it's really important to try and delay that from happening. So the insights for this is, I always put this up, how many swallows does it take to make a summer? It's a question you have, eh? And the reason why I say this is because I actually ran one of the biggest centers for a drug called Tysabri. You know about Tysabri? The other name is called natalizumab. And when the company Biogen, who made the drug, stopped doing what they call the open label extension, I had to do all of what they call the exit assessments. When people were finishing the trial, I had to examine them. And I had their notes open and I looked at all their previous disability scores. And what I did notice is that people who went onto the drug when they were early on in the disease, so still fully functional and mobile, they tended to respond very well, and they actually had a lot of them had recovery of function. They actually improved. People who went on much later on in the disease, so they were already having walking problems, they didn't respond to the drug for quite a while. But then they started flatlining and they plateaued out. And this is what we would call therapeutic lag. And so all it means is when you've already got some damage to your spinal cord and you've got mobility problems, it just takes a much longer to see the treatment effect. That's what we call lag. And you just got to look longer to see a treatment effect. Basically, the disability score, though, is always based on mobility. And so that's the blinkers that we've been looking at MS from. We've been looking at it from a leg point of view, essentially. So our disability score is dominated by mobility, not other functions. So I asked the company to look into this, and we proved by just looking at the data from one of their trials, is that if you, this is month 13 to 24, so this is year 2 after starting Tysabri, Okay, so this is proportion of patients with 6 months worsening. So this is actually getting worse. You're much more likely to get worse in year 2 when starting natalizumab than you are in year 3. Okay, and this is proportion of patients with 12. This is 12 month. That's 6 months. The same thing. It's just a different way of looking at it. But what happens is we showed in the trial this exact phenomenon. It takes time for the drug to work. Okay, so this is another message out there. If you start on a therapy, don't necessarily expect it to start working immediately. It takes time to see the treatment effect. Now, hand function. So I'll cut it short. The nerve fibers that go from your brain to your legs, they go from the brain to the bottom of the spinal cord. They're about 1 meter long, about that long, okay? The nerve fibers that go to the arms, they've got to go to the neck here, they go about that far. It's about 20 to 30 centimeters. So there's a big difference in the length of the fibers to the legs compared to the ones to the arms. So if you've got a nerve fiber that's longer and you've got a disease like MS that causes, you're much more likely to get multiple hits on the long fiber. Do you understand that? It's like throwing darts on a dartboard. Whereas the short fibers are protected because they don't get as many hits and they can survive a hit. And we know about this in terms of the peripheral nerves. So this is when you have a disease that affects your nerves. It's called a neuropathy. So if you've got a condition like diabetes, you always start off with damage to the nerves to the legs first because it's longer and more susceptible to the damage. So you get numbness in your feet before your hands. So you have to get numbness to about your mid-calf before you start noticing your fingertips going. And that's what we call a length-dependent neuropathy. And you can see about there before it affects the hands. So the hands are protected because the nerve fibers are shorter. And this particular figure kind of summarizes it up. So that's upper limb, lower extremity, upper extremity, lower extremity, shorter fiber, longer fiber. When you get a lesion, one lesion, one at the top, one in the middle, one at the bottom, you still get normal function because you can compensate for the damage. You've got enough nerve fibers. But as the lesions start accumulating, you see the lower limb gets many more, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the upper limb only gets 3. And you can see then later on you get symptoms in the lower limb, there's a slowed conduction, and then later on you get loss of function and you get some symptoms in the upper limb. So it just depends on the length of the nerve fiber. So this is what we call the length-dependent axonopathy. And if anybody's interested, we call it an axonopathy because the axon is the extension of the nerve fiber. We wrote a review article back in 2017 describing this hypothesis. And this is actually open source. So if you want to get the link, you can read about it. It's quite technical though. Any questions about this? So that's why when you see people with MS getting worse, it tends almost always to hit the legs first before the hands, and also hits the bladder and bowels because that's also long fibers. To be honest with you, bladder goes first, to be honest with you, my experience. It's more susceptible. It's got less nerve fibers, whereas the motor system protects, got more nerve fibers. So it's usually bladder, bowels, legs, then arms, and then what comes after arms? Well, hands and arms, okay? But then it goes up to speech and swallowing. So that's the next one, okay? So when you go on that scale to 9, then people start having problems with speech and swallowing because it affects the muscles of the pharynx and the larynx.
So just on that question, when you just said, it's legs first and then hands, so how would you explain if you have a weakness and trauma in a hand, in one hand,
yeah.
But that...
Well, it's a general principle. It's also random. So some people, for example, may just get by pure chance more hits in the nerve to the eye, and they may lose vision in the eye first. So about 2.5% of people, it'll hit the cerebellum, balance it before it hits the lower limb. So it's not an absolute rule, exactly. It's a bit of a random phenomenon. It's when you throw those darts, occasionally you will throw 20 darts and they'll all hit the 1 and 2, and that may be the upper limb, okay? Where instead of being more random. If it was just a more random thing, then the legs will definitely go first because most of those things on the dartboard are fibers to the lower limb. So what this actually opens up is what we call a therapeutic window. So once you've lost function in a pathway, I'll be frank with you, once you've lost function, we don't have therapies to make function better. So once you've lost function, it's very difficult to recover function. But in the past, we thought, well, once you've lost your leg function, then it's impossible to modify the disease. But it's based on this, though, based on the length of the pathway, there's these therapeutic windows that are variable. So bladder, bowels, motor, lower limb sensory, balance, upper limb sensory, cognition, vision, etc. So we've got all these therapeutic windows. Now I want to talk about this drug, methotrexate. Has anybody heard about methotrexate? This drug's an old drug, and it's used as first-line therapy in people with rheumatoid arthritis to protect the joints. This is actually a very low dose, 7.5. Most people with RA, rheumatoid, would need about 10, 12.5, 15 a day. Okay, so this is actually a very low dose. But this trial was done in the late 80s, early 90s in MS to try and slow down worsening in people with progressive disease. What's important is that 2/3 of the patients, so 2 out of 3, were already using 1 or 2 walking sticks. All right. So most of the people in this trial were quite advanced in terms of lower limb function. And this trial was done over 2 years. And what do you think happened? Okay, so when you look at the EDSS, which is a disability score, there's no treatment effect. When you looked at the ambulation index, which is a score of walking ability, no difference between the scores. So the drug was assumed not to work. Okay. However, when you looked at upper limb function using the 9-hole peg test, you all know what the 9-hole peg test is? I'll show you now what it is. It's a way of seeing how good your coordination and speed of upper limb function is. A positive trial. And then there's this thing called the box and blocks. The physio and occupational therapists will know what this is. You know those kids' toys where you have to put the shapes in? You've got to manipulate them. There's like a triangle and a square. And there's basically an adult version of that. And what it tests is how quickly you can manipulate objects and put them in the box through these little slots. And you can see that people who got methotrexate were stable on the box and blocks, whereas those that were on placebo, the dummy drug, didn't respond. So this drug actually worked very well in people with a progressive disease, but because it didn't work on the primary outcome of the trial, they said this drug doesn't work and nobody used the drug, okay? If we'd thought about this, we would have started using methotrexate in 1990 for people with progressive disease, but we didn't. Then this drug, and I was involved in this trial, so this is the ocrelizumab, Ocrevus is the other name, in primary progressive disease. The trial was called Oratorio, and the trial was positive, and the drug is now licensed, and the NHS allows us to treat a small number of people with primary progressive disease. About 1 in 10 get this drug. But the trial, this is now the curves, just to say to you that the treatment in the lower limbs was about 24% effective in terms of reducing disability. Not very effective, moderately effective. However, when you looked at the upper limb function, 9-hole peg test, the treatment effect was almost double. You can't see that, but it says 44 and 45%. This is 24 and 25%. So the treatment effect on the 9-hole peg test was almost double than it was on the walking. That insight made me actually tell the company we've got to do another trial, but this time we've got to do the trial in people that are into wheelchair users and make the primary outcome hand function. And that's why we call the trial Oratorio Hand. It became nicknamed O-Hand. Susan, you want to tell, you were in the trial?
Yeah.
Was it laborious, the trial?
Sorry?
Was it tiring for you to be in the trial? The O-Hand? Yeah.
No.
Okay. All right. So this is the O-Hand study. So we presented these results at our latest MS meeting in Barcelona in September. And it was to test whether or not it worked in upper limb function. I'll just cut to the chase. So just to tell you, these are the comparisons of the original Oratorio versus the O-Hand study. You can see we went up to 65 years of age. In the previous one, we went up to 55. And we went up to EDSS 8. So these are people that are already beginning to lose hand function. Okay? And we allowed people to have 20 years disease duration. In the previous trial, maximum was 15 years. So this particular population will be a much older, more what I call advanced population with less beginning to affect hand function. And this is the design of the trial. So this is why I'm saying to Susan, because she was part of this study, and we thank you for being in the study, is you've got to have all these visits and MRI scans and blood tests. It's very time consuming, and you have to be quite committed to be in a clinical trial. Okay, and it ran for 144 weeks on average, so it's quite a commitment. Every 12 weeks you've got to be up at the hospital, being assessed, having infusions every 6 months, etc. Okay, so this is why participating in a trial is a big commitment. And this is the overall result. This is actually a composite, so you could either get worse on the EDSS or worse on the 9-hole peg test, and the treatment effect was 30%. So people who were given ocrelizumab had a 30% less chance of getting worse in walking or upper limb function. Not impressed, are you?
No.
Okay.
I mean, what sort of time period?
144. So it's about 3 years. Yeah.
And is there any lag when you come off that?
What do you mean lag?
A lag that it's still in your system, it's stopping.
Yeah, it stays in the system for the treatment effect probably stays in the system for about 18 to 24 months. Okay.
Then no, I don't believe that data.
Anyway, so now we split it up into what those on the walking, the EDSS, was about 33% effective, but on upper limb function it was 41% effective. So it's much better. So what that actually means, if you have to convert it to something meaningful, let's say somebody goes into this trial and goes on this drug. If you're still walking, it probably delays your need for a wheelchair by about 4.5, 5 years. You may think that's not a lot. So it delays the time to a wheelchair by about 5 years. Okay. And for people who've got hand function abnormality, going on this drug delays your need for getting help with your hand function by about 8.5, 9 years. Okay. So when you model it out, that's what it means. So it keeps you independent for about 8.5 years longer. So I think that's meaningful. And if I had MS, I'd want to maintain, but that's an average, 8.5 years. So there's some people are going to be much more responsive, maybe 15 or 20 years, and there's going to be other people who respond less, and it's going to be 4 years. So the average is 8.5. Within that, though, there'll be half the population that do much better than that. Okay, and hopefully, if people go onto the drug, they'll benefit from it.
Any benefits better than no benefits?
Unless, of course, you get such bad side effects.
Well, the side effects are actually.
I'm so pleased for you.
Anyway, so
really genuinely am.
Anyway, so what's important, though, okay, and this is something we know about this drug. If you go into the trial and your first scan in the trial shows that you've got active lesions, they give you this contrast agent called gadolinium. Have you all had MRI scans with gadolinium? So if the lesions light up, it means that they are inflamed. And people who had inflamed lesions, which is about a quarter of the population, had a treatment effect of 55%. And in those who didn't have active lesions, I haven't got the slide, the treatment effect's much lower, it's about 25%. So even then, there's a differential between people with active. That's one of the reasons why the NHS only pays for the drug at the moment for active people. It's about 10% of the primary progressive population are eligible for the drug. Now, this is a really important message. Baseline EDSS. So this is actually, if you were already in a wheelchair above 6.5, your treatment response was better than people that weren't in a wheelchair. Now, the reason for that is most of the events in this thing were driven by the 9-hole peg test. So what this is telling us is that the 9-hole peg test is a better outcome measure for measuring disability in MS than the EDSS. That's what it's telling us, okay? So this has been driven by the more sensitive method. Now, the EDSS is quite an interesting thing because it's not just motor function. It's hand-eye coordination. You've got to be able to feel the pegs. You've got to be able to see the pegs, so it's depth perception. And you've got to be able to manipulate them, so it's coordination. So the 9-hole peg test is actually a very complicated measure. It's measuring vision, sensation, coordination, and motor. So it's actually measuring many different systems. And I think that's why it's a better outcome measure than just simple walking time, okay, for example.
So where are we in terms of not using EDSS?
Oh, God. The regulators love it. Anyway, just to show you, this is actually looking at the MRI. People on the drug actually had a shrinkage of their lesions. The blue line goes down. People not on the drug, on the placebo, the lesion load went up. Susan, were you on placebo or active? You're on active, weren't you? I told you that.
Active?
You were inactive, weren't you? Yeah.
No, I'm not active.
No. When you were in the trial, you were on ocrelizumab.
Oh, yes, I was, yeah.
Yeah, because some people were in the trial. There was a 2-to-1 randomization. So when you went into the study, you had more chance of being on the active drug. Obviously, people on the trial, 1 in 5 got infusion reactions that were on the active therapy, compared to only 4% on placebo. This shows you, hey, even on placebo, you get infusion reactions. Okay, this is why you've got to do blinded studies. The other worrying thing, because this is an immunosuppressive drug, it puts you at risk of infections. So these are infections, and you can see, including COVID, almost half the population on the drug got infections, 48.4%, but 45% on placebo got infections. So this is every infection. So there's a slightly higher, and when you remove COVID, you can see it's 37.5, 37. So most of this was driven by COVID. Okay, so this particular drug puts you at more risk of getting COVID. Serous infections, 6.3, 5.3. Serous infections are the ones requiring hospitalization to treat. Okay, like getting a pneumonia or something that needs to go into hospital and have antibiotics. So on this drug, just over 1 in 5 had a serious infection. But also on placebo, you can see 1 in 5 had a serious infection. So just having MS makes you at high risk of getting serious infections. And then when you remove the COVID, actually it drops to 2.4 and 3.8. So this is all that was driven. This trial was in the COVID pandemic. So this was driven by COVID. We always worry about cancers. 1% on ocrelizumab got cancers, 0.6% got cancers. The type of cancers are not the kind of cancers you get with immune suppressive therapies. Okay, the type of cancer you get with immune suppressive therapies are skin cancers and a thing called lymphoma or leukemia, lymphoma particularly. There was only one, so it was breast cancer, melanoma, pancreatic, prostate cancer. Okay, in the placebo arm, there was 1 leukemia, colon cancer, endometrial, and an endometrial cancer. So there wasn't an imbalance in cancers, and these aren't the kind of cancers you see with immune suppression. So we think this drug is quite safe in terms of cancers now. In the first trial, there was an imbalance. We thought there may have been a risk of breast cancer on the drug. That hasn't been confirmed in the study. Okay. So I won't go through this again. So in conclusions then, we've got a positive trial. And the really important part of this trial is this is the first study, okay, that's going to change the license of a drug to be done in people that are wheelchair users. Okay, so that's why it's an important study. We're now saying to the community, not only to people with MS and their families, but we're saying to the regulators who license drugs and to the NHS, these therapies work even when you're in wheelchairs, this particular therapy. But I assume this is not specific to this therapy. I assume if we did trials with all the other drugs, we'd have exactly the same observation, that if we use the 9-hole peg test, we would show that the other therapies are also working even when you've lost lower limb function and you're in a wheelchair. So that's what's important about this, okay? Okay, so this is why, now this trial didn't just happen. So I'm going to talk to you about ThinkHand. I've been working on ThinkHand. So these are my colleagues. Alison is a designer. This is Professor Klaus Schmierer, Professor K. Neurologist, Professor David Baker, who's just retired. And this is Dr. Monica Marta. We were part of this is at ECTRIMS 2016, our big meeting where it was in London. And we launched ThinkHand, which is this program to raise awareness about hand function. So one of the things is we wanted people to measure their own 9-hole peg test. Now, how much do you think this costs? Okay. So I told people to buy their own 9-hole peg tests. When you go onto Amazon, it's about £100+. 103 pounds, 127 pounds. Okay? It's expensive, isn't it?
Or cardboard.
Yeah, so that's why we designed a cardboard one. So Alison, I just showed you there, her and her husband, they designers, and so we decided to make an environmentally friendly, cheap cardboard 9-hole peg test. Okay, the manufacturing costs for this are around about £2.20. They would come much cheaper if we made hundreds of thousands of them. But when you do a run, it's kind of a manual run, so it has to be done on a laser cutter, and so it's basically, this costs about £2.20 to make. Okay, and this is a medical student from Austria who was with us, And you can go online and see how to work it. But it works exactly the same way as the plastic one. Actually, people prefer this one because the little pegs we use are the little dowels, and they've got little ridges in them, and they're easy to pick up. You don't drop them. So the plastic ones are easy to drop. So actually, you do this one slightly quicker than the plastic one, on average. But it doesn't matter. You can see they correlate very well. This is the plastic version, this is the cardboard version. Okay. The message is if you're going to measure your hand function, you just use the same one all the time. You don't mix and match. So if you're going to measure your 9-hole peg test, you do it with the cardboard one all the time, or you do it with the plastic one all the time. Actually, we've got a CE mark, so ours is actually quality approved. The plastic one isn't quality approved. And the reason why the plastic one was developed was because it used to be made out of wood. Okay, the original 9-hole peg test was wood. The thing about it is you can't wash wood down, and so the plastic one is designed to, when somebody's used it, you can actually disinfect the pegs, for example. So that's why it's used in trials. So I'm almost certain, Susan, you used the plastic one in the trial, hey? Yeah. How many times you drop the pegs? Once or twice. They're quite sticky, slippery, aren't they?
They are slippery,
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, you can buy these. We sell them online. Now we sell them online for about £10. And the reason we have to sell them online for £10 is because we got a company that does all the logistics for us. And they charge us a rental space, and that kind of covers the costs of selling them internationally. So if they've got to ship a 9-hole peg test off to Peru, it costs a lot more than having to ship it off to Buckinghamshire or Berkshire, which doesn't cost much, but on average it costs about £10 per test to make it and sell it. Okay, so we don't make any profit. We don't make zero profit on it. It actually was costing us, and we've now given it away. So the company that designs and sells it uses the money that comes in from selling the test just to make the next batch, for example. So it's basically a loss leader.
How often should you be using it for yourself to keep track?
Up to you. Some people do it once a week, but on average, most centers do it every 6 months or every 12 months. Anyway, so this is us at Expo. We had a stand around the ThinkHand. There's the two color versions, and this is Monica with our poster. We decided to actually put a poster up at Expo, and to make the point, we actually made it out of cardboard, and we made it by hand, and we've actually got this was by far the most popular poster at Expo because it was handmade to make the point that your hand function is important. Okay, and we made it out of cardboard, so it's recycled cardboard to make it environmentally friendly, and we put up 95% there for a reason. Okay, 95%. So the 95% comes from this survey. We did a survey for the Expo. We asked people with the disease, should MSs in wheelchairs be excluded from progressive trials? And you can see most people said no. All right. In other words, people who are wheelchair users want to be part of trials. And that was the message we were trying to get across, is to try and make the MS community aware that there was an unmet need in wheelchair users. Another question, upper limb function is more important than lower limb function. Interestingly enough, the MS community said yes. 92% said they would rather have maintained upper limb function versus no. So think about the things that you lose if you can't use your hands. What do you think came out number one in our survey? The function people value the most? Eating, yeah. Going to the toilet. Brushing your teeth. Yeah, so what came up on top, Bob?
Oh, TV remote control.
Remote control, yeah, using your phone. So what came out on top was a cluster of functions that had to do with grooming. So washing your hair, brushing your hair, drying your hair, putting in earrings, putting on makeup, these things, plucking your eyebrows, putting on eyeshadow. What came up by far the most important was grooming functions, being able to groom yourself. Isn't that interesting? It shows you how important grooming is as a social function, to be honest with you. But anyway, it's all about hand function. Do you think patients with wheelchairs should be included in progressive MS trials? This is, again, the majority said yes. This is for clinicians, though. This is a question to UK neurologists. It wasn't as black and white as the people with the disease. You can see it's 50%. So there was a disconnect here between what clinicians were thinking and what people with the disease were thinking. Anyway, we had a ThinkHand awareness. Now, we did this awareness meeting. We spent a lot of money having a social event. And the reason we wanted the social event because we wanted the MS Society to back a particular application for a clinical trial. And they were umming and ahhing about doing it. So we brought everybody together to a ThinkHand event. And we had three people with MS to showcase hand function. So the first one is we had a very famous designer. She's actually EDSS 9, this designer. She's lost the ability to use her hands. And she still actually makes jewelry by having two technicians that do what she tells them to do, okay? And she's a very famous jewelry designer. There's been books written about her, and she still does exhibitions twice a year. And she sells her stuff for great, very expensive, okay? Her name is Romilly Soiree Smith. She's not in the closet, so people know she's got MS. But she doesn't want people to buy her jewelry because she's got MS. So she doesn't like to promote that fact. She wants people to buy her jewelry because she is Romilly Soiree Smith, not somebody with MS, okay? But you can go online and look her up. And she has an exhibition every year at the Goldsmiths exhibition, and she sells out. And her stuff is really expensive. The cheapest earrings will be about £1,200, okay? For example. This is a patient of mine. He's a Czech from the Czech Republic, and he retrained as an artist. And he does art, and we launched his art, the first exhibition he had. And I don't know if anybody knows this guy. His name is Kishon Khan. So his brother is a neurologist at Stoke Mandeville, and he's a jazz musician. This is Shamoon's brother. Okay, and he runs a band, and he plays keyboards and percussion. And he's got quite a lot of, he's a really good artist, okay? What is interesting is he was losing function in one hand, and then in COVID lockdown, he decided he was just playing one-handed keyboards. And he'll tell you the story. So in COVID, he decided to start rehabbing this hand, and by the end of COVID, he was playing with both hands again. So that's another message about this is if you're beginning to lose function and you stop using it, you will lose it, okay? So you've got to use it to lose it.
How did you rehab it?
Pardon?
What did you do to rehab it?
Just playing the piano. Yeah, he was forcing himself to play with that hand again. Yep. Redid his scales. Anyway, so this is actually this was my old office. I don't have my office anymore. I've got a shared office, but I had the Bart's MS thing up there. So when anybody came into my office, I have a discussion around hand function, okay? Yes, somebody's asking me a question?
I was going to ask, the peg test.
Yeah.
Well, could you not use that as a way of physio?
Yes, actually, to be honest with you, that's one of the problems we had and when we designed our charity is that when you give somebody a tool to measure, they also use it for rehab. So there's one particular patient, Tim Dignan, for example, he actually started doing the 9-hole peg test every day, and he was actually improving his scores. And that's because he was using it as a rehab tool. So you can, but it's not very interesting to do the 9-hole peg test every day. That's why we did it. I've taken the slides out. We launched that thing called Over and Under. We gave people with multiple sclerosis like a threading task to try and improve hand function. Anyway, we got into the newspapers with this, and then we got the trial funded. So the MS Society came back. After that meeting, they realized hand function is really important. So they actually sponsored and supported the study. And this has now been launched, and we fully recruited, and we get the results at the end of next year. I think the last patient out will be December 26. Okay. So the results of this study, this is not Ocrevus, this is cladribine tablets. It's called Mavenclad. People with EDSS 6.5 to 8.5, placebo or cladribine, and we're measuring 9-hole peg tests across the trial. Okay. And it's all over the UK, funded by the MRC, NHS, MS Society, and then Merck, the company that makes cladribine, has given us the drug, with lots of other support from organizations. It's a study across the UK. So has it been a success? I think it has, because we got ourselves into the newspapers at least, okay? And we actually won a public engagement award. Our public engagement award is from our university for all the work we've done on it, 9-hole peg test, our public engagement campaign. They thought it was worthy of giving us an award. And I also want to say to you is the ThinkHand timeline is not just OHAN. But underlying it, there's been a whole lot of research. The first insights actually came from animal studies. So this is another reason why we need to do animal studies. The length-dependent theory came from studying an animal model of MS, to be honest with you. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's been underlying this. So it's not just one thing. So when I talk about hand, it's just the proof behind it. There's been about 15 to 20 years of work. Okay, that's the thing about research in a field. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes years. And this is the part of the team. So thank you, and I'll take questions. Thank you very much.